Lecture 14. Happily Ever After. How to End a Plot.
Starting a narrative is daunting. Bringing one to an end can be tricky. You just can't win. The end of a plot is the last thing a reader sees, and what she thinks of the ending often irreversibly colors her opinion of the entire narrative. A plot that has a successful, or at least a vivid and memorable ending, can make a mediocre narrative seem better than it is, while a weak or unconvincing ending can make an otherwise superb narrative lose its luster. Our old friend E.M. Forster thought that wobbly endings were a common problem for novels in particular. He had this to say about it in Aspects of the Novel. Nearly all novels are feeble at the end. This is because the plot requires to be wound up. Why is this necessary? Why is there not a convention which allows a novelist to stop as soon as he feels muddled or bored? Alas, he has to round things off, and usually the characters go dead while he is at work, and our final impression of them is through deadness. Incidents and people that occurred at first for their own sake now have to contribute to the denouement. In the end, even the author feels he is being a little foolish. Most novels do fail here. There is this disastrous standstill while logic takes over the command from flesh and blood. I suspect this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. Given that Aspects of the Novel is essentially a celebration of careful craftsmanship, I doubt that Forster is entirely serious when he wishes that novelists could just stop as soon as they get muddled or bored. And remember that Forster was notoriously ambivalent about plot. Remember how he said in a droopy, regretful voice that, yes, oh dear, yes, the novel tells a story. But even so, Forster is expressing a peevishness that all writers feel at one time or another. He's also right that it's not uncommon for novels, even great ones, to fall apart at the end. The last quarter of Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is notoriously weak, especially after Tom Sawyer turns up in the story. The comedy turns labored, the narrative loses momentum, and the plot is resolved in a series of unconvincing contrivances. You can tell that Twain got, well, muddled and bored and just wanted to wrap things up. One of my favorite books, Joseph Conrad's Nostromo, has the most brilliant opening third of any novel I've ever read. The last third of it is much more melodramatic and conventional than the rest of the book. It's almost as if Conrad got tired or lost his nerve toward the end. There are some other factors at play that make endings difficult to talk about. For one thing, what people consider a good ending is dependent on individual taste. For example, many readers are disappointed if a romance doesn't end with the couple getting together, while others think a conventional happy ending is sentimental and unrealistic. For another thing, what writers and readers consider a good ending has changed over time. The endings of many great 19th century novels now strike many modern readers as contrived and unconvincing. Charles Dickens is indisputably a great writer, but some of his novels have endings that seem ludicrously sentimental to a modern reader. The good characters find love, security, and happiness, while the bad characters are either humiliated or killed off. Or, in the case of Fagin in Oliver Twist, they are humiliated and killed off. Some classic novels seem unconvincing to a modern reader because our cultural, social, and moral assumptions have changed. Women who have sex outside of marriage are no longer expected to kill themselves, the way they do in several famous 19th century novels. And some famous 19th century endings have been so widely imitated that they've become hackneyed. At the end of Jane Eyre, a poor but intelligent and virtuous woman wins the love of a brooding, sexually magnetic rich guy. However original this may have been when Charlotte Bronte was alive, now it's a trope in modern romance novels and a cliché of Hollywood romantic comedies. But even if they disagree about the particulars, nearly everyone agrees on the two fundamental qualities that a good ending should have. Namely, it should be both believable and satisfying. Believability and satisfaction are not the same, however, and they are not interchangeable. It's possible for an ending to be believable without being satisfying. In real life, for example, killers often get away with murder. or two lovers who seem perfect for each other never actually get together. Neither of these outcomes would be very satisfying in a conventional narrative. However, on the other hand, it's not possible for an ending to be both satisfying but not believable. If the killer is caught, or the lovers are brought together as a result of a blatant contrivance on the part of the author, the ending is unsatisfying because we don't believe it. And it should go without saying that a satisfying ending is not necessarily a happy one. Some of the greatest literary novels ever written have unhappy endings. And in recent decades, a lot of first-rate genre fiction has come to rely on unhappy but dramatically satisfying endings. George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones, the first novel in his Song of Ice and Fire series, ends with the death of the novel's noblest character. So what do we mean when we say that an ending is believable? In part, believability depends on what we as readers bring to a story. Our own individual understanding of how the world works and what real people are like helps determine what we will believe in a work of fiction. This doesn't mean the rules of the real world can't be bent. Readers are willing to accept that the laws of nature can be altered, broken, or ignored in fantasy, horror, and science fiction, as long as you provide an alternate set of rules for your fictional world and stick to them. Readers of any genre, however, are less likely to believe a character whose final actions violate their understanding of human psychology. Different readers have different expectations of how human beings think and behave, or how human beings ought to think or behave. An ending that strikes one reader as completely plausible and even admirable will strike another reader as preposterous and even offensive. Take the ending of Jane Eyre again. Mr. Rochester may be brooding and sexually magnetic, but he persuades Jane to fall in love with him without bothering to tell her that he's already married and that he's keeping his crazy first wife locked in his attic. And yet, at the end of the novel, after a series of twists that include a surprise inheritance for Jane and a house fire that conveniently kills the first Mrs. Rochester, Jane Eyre happily marries Mr. Rochester. Most readers accept this ending. For one thing, we take into account the narrative conventions of the time the novel was written. For another, we want Jane to be happy because she is such an admirable character. Still, it's possible to imagine a reader who just can't believe that someone as smart and independent as Jane would give someone as manipulative and self-serving as Mr. Rochester a second chance. Our willingness to believe the ending of Jane Eyre depends partly on our general understanding of human nature, but it also depends on our understanding of Jane Eyre herself as an individual character. If character is more fundamental to fiction than plot, as I argued in Lecture 3, then the key to crafting a believable ending is staying true to the nature of your characters. You can make an ending believable if you can get the reader to play along with the premise of your narrative, and if you play fair with the reader by obeying your own rules. But respecting your own characters is especially important. But, as I said a moment ago, just because an ending is believable doesn't make it satisfying. In the terminology of my long-dormant bachelor's degree in philosophy, believability is a necessary condition of a satisfying ending, but not a sufficient one. And as we've just seen, believability isn't an absolute quality. Reasonable people can disagree over whether an ending is credible or not. But satisfaction is an even more ineffable and unquantifiable quality, one that is even more dependent on taste and personal experience. You can at least make a case that a particular ending is believable. You can argue that it's prepared for, that the writer played by the rules, and so on. But you cannot convince a skeptic that an ending is satisfying, any more than you can make someone change his mind about a food he doesn't like. If you don't like onions, no amount of argument is going to make you like onions. Consider the passionate arguments that erupt online or around water coolers after the final episodes of such popular television series as The Sopranos or Breaking Bad. If you were annoyed and unsatisfied at the abrupt disappearance of Tony Soprano in the very last moments of his final episode, no amount of passionate exegesis from me is going to change your mind. Just as it is with onions, satisfaction is a wholly subjective judgment. Endings are a matter of taste, and as the Latin maxim has it, de gustibus non est disputandum. In matters of taste, there can be no dispute. At this point, perhaps we should throw up our hands like E.M. Forster, but as even he would admit, yes, oh dear yes, a work of fiction must have an ending. So let's just accept the fact that an ending cannot be all things to all people. And let's take a look at 3 endings that are considered satisfying by most readers. In The Art of Fiction, our other old friend, John Gardner, says that there are 2 ways a narrative can end. In resolution, when no further event can take place, the murderer has been caught and hanged, the diamond has been found and restored to its owner, the elusive lady has been captured and married, or in logical exhaustion, our recognition that we've reached the stage of infinite repetition. More events might follow, perhaps from now till kingdom come, but they will all express the same thing. Now, this is an oversimplification because there are other types of endings, not to mention hybrid varieties, but these 2 definitions probably cover most possibilities. Let's start with the sort of ending Gardner calls resolution, but which I have called a binary ending. As you may recall, this is the kind of ending that resolves an either-or situation or answers a simple question that was posed in the opening pages of the narrative. This is the sort of ending you find in most best-selling novels, popular movies, and television shows. Who committed the crime? Will the 2 star-crossed lovers get together? Will the intelligence agent foil the supervillain's plot? Will the hero of the epic fantasy complete his quest? Plots with binary endings are often dismissed as mechanical and contrived, and to be honest, many of them are. You could even argue that the endings of some of these simple binary narratives is the least important thing about them, and the real reason we enjoy them is that we enjoy the setting or the characters. For example, I used to watch reruns of the television drama Law and Order obsessively. Even when I knew I'd seen an episode once or twice already, I'd watch it again anyway, because I could never remember how it turned out. I came to realize that my pleasure in watching the show didn't come from the ending, but from the time I spent in the company of characters like Sam McCoy or Lenny Briscoe. This is often the case with well-written genre narratives. The journey is interesting, even if the destination turns out to be unmemorable. But let's not dismiss binary endings out of hand. There are a lot of great narratives where the ending is both immensely satisfying and unforgettable, and maybe even the high point of the story. John le Carré's great spy novel, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, is the story of a veteran British spy named George Smiley, who was asked by the British Intelligence Service to find a Soviet mole in their midst. This is a binary ending with a vengeance, along the lines of a classic country house mystery. Smiley assembles a list of suspects and investigates each one. Then, in a sweaty-palmed climactic scene, he discovers which one of his colleagues actually is a Soviet spy. Much of the fun of the book lies in the twists and turns of the investigation and in le Carré's sharp delineation of his large cast of characters. But the ending is tremendously satisfying and not mechanical or contrived at all. This is because le Carré complicates the ending by making the mole an upper-class Englishman and a former lover of Smiley's wife. This means that the mole is not just a traitor to his country, but a traitor to his class and to his professional colleagues. It's a binary ending with layers, because the mole's betrayal is at once political, social, and personal. Many literary novels also have binary endings. Will Elizabeth Bennet marry Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice? Will Ahab catch and kill Moby Dick? Will Jay Gatsby win Daisy Buchanan back from her brutish husband in The Great Gatsby? One literary story in particular has perhaps the most satisfying binary ending I've ever read. Henry James's novella, The Aspern Papers, is narrated by an unnamed literary critic whose passion is a long-dead American poet named Jeffrey Aspern. The critic has learned that some letters from Aspern may still be in the possession of the poet's former lover, who is now a very old woman living in Venice. The critic then goes to Venice, where he learns that the old woman, Juliana Bordereau, is living in a decaying old palazzo in the company of her plain, middle-aged niece, Miss Tina. Because Juliana and Miss Tina are living in poverty, the critic insinuates himself into their house by renting a room from them. And because he suspects that Juliana has no intention of letting anyone see the letters, he tries to allay her suspicions by pretending to be romantically interested in Miss Tina. This is a tight little triangle of characters: the unscrupulous narrator, the suspicious old woman in possession of a priceless literary treasure, and the lonely middle-aged woman. And it sets up not one, not two, but three binary questions. Will the critic get the letters? Will Juliana discover his true intentions? Will the critic callously break Miss Tina's heart? James shows us the wary dance of these three characters through a series of impeccably crafted scenes, each one of which ratchets the tension up a little higher. The novella culminates in an almost Gothic climax in the middle of the night, when the narrator tries to break into the desk where he thinks the letters might be hidden and is caught in the act by Juliana. She curses him and he flees the house. Juliana dies soon thereafter, and the narrator returns to the house to ask Miss Tina if she might let him have the papers. Miss Tina hints that she might, if he agrees to marry her. The narrator flees again because he can't imagine marrying someone he thinks of as a ridiculous, pathetic, provincial old woman. It goes without saying that the narrator of the aspirin papers is no prince. But he's desperate for the papers. So in the final pages of the novella, when the narrator returns once more to the palazzo, where Miss Tina has changed somehow, as he puts it, her look of forgiveness, of absolution, made her angelic. It beautified her. She was younger. She was not a ridiculous old woman. This trick of her expression, this magic of her spirit, transfigured her. And while I still noted it, I heard a whisper somewhere in the depths of my conscience, why not? After all, why not? It seemed to me I could pay the price. In other words, at the end of the story, the critic is tempted to marry Miss Tina in order to get the letters. Then, on the very last page of the novella, Henry James springs the trap he has expertly laid for both the narrator and the reader, when Miss Tina reveals that she burned the letters one by one the night before. And so the aspirin papers fulfills the reader's expectations by answering all three of the binary questions it posed at the start. No, the critic does not get the papers. Yes, Juliana discovers his true intentions. As for the third question, will Miss Tina's heart be broken? The answer turns out to be the most satisfying twist in the story, because Miss Tina turns out to be as skillful and ruthless a player as the narrator. If the narrator did break her heart, Miss Tina earns her revenge by breaking his, by denying him the one thing he ever really wanted. This is storytelling of the highest order. Henry James not only imagines a binary situation that generates suspense, he peoples the plot with three vivid and sharply defined characters and stays true to them. There is the conniving narrator who isn't nearly as clever as he thinks he is. There is the mistrustful old woman who has spent a lifetime living in the shadow of a famous poet. And there is the watchful spinster who shines with beauty in her one moment of bitter triumph. The reversal at the end is the best kind of surprise, where the reader is thinking simultaneously, I did not see that coming, and of course. Now let's talk about the sort of ending that Gardner calls a case of logical exhaustion. This is the point at which a narrative has reached its deepest understanding of a character or a situation, and beyond which it would just be repeating itself. This sort of ending does not rely on raising a binary expectation in the reader, but it does require the early pages to draw the reader into the narrative by setting up an expectation in the reader that some sort of revelation is going to occur. A variety of this kind of ending is the epiphany, which I explained a couple of lectures ago. The example I used then was James Joyce's long story, The Dead. But this time, I want to talk about the short story Miss Brill by Catherine Mansfield, one of Joyce's contemporaries. It's only 5 pages long, and like many Epiphany stories, it doesn't really have a plot. But like the best of the Epiphany stories, it is carefully constructed to deliver a devastating emotional blow at the end. Miss Brill is a late middle-aged Englishwoman who lives alone in a rented room in a seaside town in France, where she makes her living teaching English. Every Sunday, she sits on a bench in the public gardens, listening to a brass band and watching the crowd pass by. She especially enjoys eavesdropping on the conversations of the other people who sometimes share her bench. In the opening paragraph, Miss Brill is seated on the bench on a bright but slightly chilly Sunday afternoon. She is wearing a fox stole, the sort of fur wrap that still has the head, feet, and tail of the fox at either end, and she recalls the pleasure she took in lifting it out of its box and brushing it before she put it on and left her room. The middle section of the story is like Georges Seurat's brilliantly detailed pointillist painting, A Sunday on La Grande Jatte, as Miss Brill observes the old married couple on the bench next to her, watches children play, and witnesses an old woman trying unsuccessfully to flirt with an elderly man. She takes delight in thinking of the scene as a kind of play in which she's one of the actors. She even enters into a lovely fantasy in which everyone in the park starts to sing along with the band. The young ones, the laughing ones who were moving together, they would begin, and the men's voices, very resolute and brave, would join them. And then she too, and the others on the benches. They would come in with a kind of accompaniment, something low, that scarcely rose or fell, something so beautiful, moving. And Miss Brill's eyes filled with tears, and she looked smiling at all the other members of the company. Yes, we understand, she thought. But what they understood, she didn't know. This moment when Miss Brill feels a communion with all the other people in the park is immediately ruined, however. An amorous young couple sit on the bench next to her, and the girl refuses to kiss the boy because of that stupid old thing at the end of the bench. It takes a moment for the reader and Miss Brill to realize that the stupid old thing she's referring to is Miss Brill herself. The girl goes on to make fun of Miss Brill's beloved fox stole by comparing it to a dead fish. Then the story jumps abruptly to its last two paragraphs, where Miss Brill returns to her tiny, shabby room and sits on the bed for a long time. The story ends like this. The box that the fur came out of was on the bed. She unclasped the necklet quickly, without looking, laid it inside. But when she put the lid on, she thought she heard something crying. I'm not sure my summary can evoke the story's power, but I hope it gives you at least an idea of the elements that make it work. Every sharply observed detail and every slight shift of emotion builds toward a single piercing epiphany. Mansfield starts by introducing a woman whose most elegant possession is an old fox stole, which she treats with loving care because it reminds her of her youth. Then, in the middle section, in the manner of Mrs. Dalloway, Mansfield shows us the park through Miss Brill's eyes and allows us to participate in Miss Brill's reactions. We see how she prides herself on her gift of quiet observation, and we share the slight superiority she feels towards the people she observes so sharply. Then we share her moment of communion. She is one of the people in the park, after all, one of the players in this play they all put on each Sunday. She takes brief respite from her loneliness by indulging in the fantasy of everyone singing together, only to have her illusions shattered by two thoughtless young lovers. And just as the end of the aspirin papers clicks shut like a trap on the last page, so does the last paragraph of Miss Brill. The title character suddenly and unexpectedly sees herself as the world sees her. And from that slight observational remove that she was so proud of in the park, she can hear herself weeping. There is no binary plot here, no situation to resolve. But we have reached the point that Gardner called logical exhaustion. Miss Brill has had a devastating insight into her own life, and the reader has shared that devastating insight. This insight changes everything that Miss Brill and the reader had thought up to this point, and it cannot be taken back. Her life will go on, but there is nothing new left to learn. The story moves sentence by sentence with ruthless efficiency to an ending that's every bit as precision engineered and every bit as powerful as the end of the aspirin papers. Let's look now at a sort of hybrid ending, existing halfway between the binary ending and the epiphany. Flannery O'Connor's story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is about a Southern family who take a drive to Florida and end up being murdered on a lonely country road by a serial killer. The killer, who is called the Misfit, is mentioned in the story's very first paragraph. The grandmother of the family, who is the story's main point of view character, reads aloud from the newspaper about his recent escape from prison. After that, the misfit is mentioned only once more, briefly, before he and his henchmen turn up later in the story, after the family has driven its car into a ditch. Meanwhile, the central portion of the story is a comic portrayal of the family bickering with each other in the car and stopping for barbecue. The reappearance of the misfit might have been a Dickensian coincidence in the hands of a lesser writer, but his appearance in the newspaper in the first paragraph is played for laughs. As a result, when he reappears at the end, full of genuine menace, the reader's experience mirrors that of the family as they slowly realize they're about to die. This can't be happening, you think the first time you read the story, which is exactly what the family must be thinking. But because it is so skillfully prepared for, the ending leads you to a radical change of perspective. Instead of finding the coincidence unbelievable, you find instead that the ending alters your understanding of everything that came before. The grandmother's foolishness, for example, which was funny and kind of sweet for most of the story, ends up becoming tragic and pitiable. The offhand references to the misfit in the first paragraph and briefly again in the middle of the story turn out to be foreshadowing. They are hints, if only we'd picked up on them, of a version of the world that is both profound and terrifying. The story closes with the same finality as the aspirin papers. O'Connor prepares for her ending with as much skill as Henry James does. But where Henry James lays his plot points out where the reader can see them, O'Connor hides hers behind a scrim of irony. The misfit is foreshadowed in the first paragraph, but in such a way that a first-time reader doesn't suspect he's important. He's just the groundless fear of an old woman. And O'Connor also skillfully underplays the plot twists that lead to the family's death. It is the grandmother's insistence that they take a side trip to visit a house she used to know that leads to their accident. And what seals the family's doom is the fact that she calls the misfit by his nickname as soon as she sees him. These two mistakes by the grandmother are simultaneously shrewdly observed bits of her character and tripwires that lead inevitably to her death and to the deaths of her loved ones. The ending of A Good Man is hard to find, falls halfway between a binary ending and an epiphany. On the one hand, it ends definitively, with the murder of several of its characters. But like an epiphany story, it radically changes everything the reader thought about what came before. It doesn't answer a question that was openly posed at the beginning of the story, but instead it answers a question that the reader didn't even realize was being posed until after he finishes the story. The question is the world a safe place? And the story answers with a definitive no. What makes these three endings satisfying? I can't say for certain, because not every reader will necessarily find them as satisfying as I do. But I can tell you what they have in common. Each one is prepared for, starting with the first page or even the first paragraph of the narrative. The opening of the aspirin papers sets up all three binary questions that the ending answers. The misfit is mentioned in the very first paragraph of A Good Man is Hard to Find. And Miss Brill's faded fox stole, the symbol of her own faded appeal, is mentioned in the very first paragraph. Think back to John Gardner's definitions of how a narrative can end, that a story either resolves or it logically exhausts itself. All three of these endings essentially leave the reader with nothing left to know. Each writer has taken us as far as we can go. All the major questions are answered, and we have gained our deepest understanding of the situation or the characters. In the last lecture, I talked about two ways of starting a plot. One is to work toward an ending you already know. The other is to let the plot tell you what the ending should be. All three of these endings are more or less airtight and perfectly prepared for. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Henry James, Catherine Mansfield, and Flannery O'Connor knew the ending of each story before they started. They may very well have. I don't actually know. But it seems to me that either method may generate a satisfying ending. At first glance, it might seem that knowing the ending in advance is the easiest way to write, because you can direct the story at every point to head in that direction. But you also run the risk of forcing the characters in a particular direction whether they want to go there or not. In that case, your plot can seem contrived and unlifelike, and your characters seem more like puppets than living, breathing people. It may be that not knowing where you're going is easier than planning ahead. Not knowing where you're going may even lead to a more satisfying ending.